Welcome to Shoot Like a Girl, a podcast featuring interviews with extraordinary military women from around the world who push their limits on and off duty. I'm your host, Kate Stewart, and this is episode number 28. Today's guest is retired Lieutenant Colonel Shelley Peters. Shelley is a trailblazer for women and the Black community. In 1982, she became the first Black woman to serve in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. She then joined the Canadian Forces in 1986 as a military police officer. From April to October 2002, she served as the Provost Marshal and Chief Force Protection Officer for the multinational NATO mission in Bosnia. She has also held positions such as the Director of Human Rights and Diversity and the Deputy Chair for the Committee of Women in the NATO Forces. Shelley retired from the Canadian Forces in 2012 and entered a career in the federal public service.
Steady, nice and steady. Light, hill, cover. I'm a steamroller, baby. I'm a steamroller, baby. Just a rolling down the line. Just a rolling down the line. I'm a steamroller, baby. I'm a steamroller, baby. Just a rolling down the line. Just a rolling down the line. So you better get out of my way now. So you better get out of my way now. Before I roll all over you. Before I roll all over you.
So Shelley, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for your time tonight. I'm very excited to interview you.
Thank you.
So let's start from the beginning. Where did you grow up?
I was born in St. John, New Brunswick, but my father joined the military shortly after I was born. So I kind of grew up on various military bases across the country. So I've been in a lot of places, but I still consider New Brunswick to be home.
Did you have any other military members in your family or just your father?
Just my father, yes.
And what was that like, having a father as a military member?
It was all that we knew. I'm the oldest of three girls, so we always had the three of us as we were traveling, because at that time you moved kind of every couple of years. So it seemed like we were always on the move to a different part of Canada. But I mean, it was just a life that we understood. You know, we grew up on military bases, so you're very much in an insulated kind of community. So it was, I thought it was great. It gave us an opportunity to see the country, which otherwise we wouldn't necessarily. And obviously I enjoyed the lifestyle because I ultimately decided to pursue the same career path.
Mm-hmm. And I guess kind of the opposite of me, because I grew up in one spot my whole life. But did you find that difficult as a kid, kind of having to pick up and then readjust and sort of make a new friend group each location that you moved to?
Looking back on it, I don't think we really, understood that it was that kind of disruptive. And because I have, my two sisters, we always had, each other kind of thing as we were moving around. And for me, it's worked out quite well, because there are very few communities within Canada that I can't go to now that I don't know somebody. So I've had the opportunity to move around quite frequently, and did that also during my career. And so for me, I'm in Ottawa now, and I've been here for a number of years. That is strange to me, to be in one place for an extended period of time. So I think it was great. We were resilient. We got used to kind of moving around and making new friends and getting involved in community and activities. And that was just the way that it was.
And that sort of leads into my next question. So what sort of activities were you involved with as a child?
My sisters and I, between the three of us, we were involved in everything going. So I tended more towards sports. So any kind of sports teams. I played softball, I played soccer, I played basketball, volleyball. So anything that I could do from a sports perspective. My other two sisters, less in the athletics and more on like music programs, those types of things. So it was just, and all of those activities were offered to us on the military bases. That was the nice thing about it, is that they had a full spectrum of programming for kids. Because in many instances, one or both of the parents were away a lot. So the community really offered those programs in order for the kids to have something to do.
Yeah, definitely a very important aspect of that military life is just making sure that the families are looked after and that they have the support that they need, because the members do go away a lot. And so was your dad either deployed a lot, or did he go away a lot on training?
My father was a pilot. he was away flying a lot. He started out on fighter planes, so those trips were a lot shorter. So it seemed, that was when I was quite a bit younger. So, but it seemed like he was around a lot. But we knew that he went away kind of and did some type of work. He moved on to transport aircraft, and those aircraft were had much longer flights. So it wouldn't be unusual for him to be gone a couple of weeks out of every month, kind of thing. And then he flew with the Snowbirds for a while. So of course they have a touring season, and they're away a lot. But the one thing about it, and the thing that I remember most is that when I had a big event, he always managed to be there. And I don't know how he did it, and I really, as a child, didn't have an appreciation for it. And having had a couple of kids of my own, I know how much, planning and coordination that requires. But I don't recall there ever being a time when he wasn't there when I really needed him to be there.
Right. That's awesome. That's so amazing that he somehow managed to work all of the things that go on behind the scenes with military and scheduling and all of that stuff, and managed to make it to those events. And so, like you were saying, your father didn't just have sort of a regular career in the military. He had a very impressive career and a trailblazer for the Black community as well. And so what was it like having your father be sort of like a higher profile individual? Or did you even look at it that way when you were younger?
It's funny because we really didn't. I mean, to us, he was dad. And, and as we get older and we start to look back on things and recognize that there was some discrimination within the community, and friends weren't allowed to play with us, those types of things. But as kids, you don't really recognize exactly what's going on. It's only when you're older and you can look back and say, oh, well, that was very discriminatory, and that was an unfortunate set of circumstances. But my parents were, it was a mixed race marriage, which in its day was basically unheard of. So although neither one of them have really talked about it, and dad's passed away now, but my mom is still alive, they never really talked about it very much. But it had to have been really, really difficult. And it is what it is. It was the way people were at the time. And, the military is a subset of the rest of the population. So we shouldn't fool ourselves in thinking that discrimination doesn't exist within the military, because it absolutely does. I was very proud of my father. He accomplished a lot. He was very determined and, very quiet, but he set his objectives and then he moved forward. When I was working in the Air Reserves in Trenton, as I was a little bit older, he was there and he was the first human rights officer, and I didn't even know what a human rights officer was. And then as I learned it, I thought, well, why do we need to have a human rights officer? Well, we did because for the very reasons that I've articulated, that there was discrimination there, that people were being discriminated against for a variety of reasons, and it was important enough to Dad to take that role on. So for me, he's always been that example that, if something needs to be done, you need to roll up your sleeves and get involved in it as well, and make the changes that you can make and impact the people that you can make. But he was very, very successful. Wasn't without difficulty, but that didn't deter him. He was focused, and as a result of that, was quite accomplished.
And so from an early age, did you have this idea that you wanted to follow in his footsteps and join the military, or was there some other career that you thought, oh, I want to do this when I grow up?
Yeah, my initial thoughts was not the military, although I did join the Air Reserves, but that was a way for me to pay for my college when I was going through college. I always wanted to be involved in law enforcement. So in fact, the first organization that I joined after I graduated was the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And I spent 5 years with the RCMP. And, it was an interesting 5 years. I learned a lot, but I was much more comfortable in the military environment. So when I had an opportunity to join the Canadian Forces as a military police officer, I took that opportunity. And it was an organization that I knew. It was an organization that offered me the possibility to pursue, the career in law enforcement, and also have the familiarity with the military as well.
So when you went off to recruit training as an RCMP member, how did you find that initial training, and was it very tough physically and mentally? Did you find that you were well prepared for it?
It was way tougher than I had envisioned, both physically, that was kind of the first part of it. A large portion of the training was the physical fitness, and for obvious reasons. You have to be able to protect yourself. So the training was very physical, and we were an all-female troop, one of the only ones in depot at the time. And so when we were having, our sessions with martial arts, that type of thing, we were competing against male troops. There weren't other female troops for us to compete against. So that gave us it was a real eye opener to recognize, there are realities of the strength that females have. So you aren't going to necessarily be successful in overtaking them from a strength perspective, but the technique is important. So spent a lot of emphasis and a lot of time on that. So the physical side of it was very difficult, and the mental side of it was what was difficult as well. And the training is designed to kind of break you down and then build you back up and give you the confidence that you need to be able to go out onto the street and police effectively after you've completed 6 months of training. So and I look back on it now, and I wonder how I made it through. But the other thing that we got out of it was, like, as the female troop that were there, we needed to count on each other, and we needed to support each other. And we very quickly realized that different members of the troop had different experiences and different strengths. And because I had done a stint with the Air Reserves, the part with respect to uniform and boots and all those types of things that you learn in the military came in very handy. And because some of my troop mates didn't have that experience, they didn't know how to iron, they didn't know how to shine boots. So that was my contribution, was being able to help them get their uniforms ready, whereas others had experiences in other areas. So we used the strengths that each individual brought forward in order to help the team be successful.
And so they didn't have any mixed gender troops at all at that time, did they?
No, there weren't any. We were one of the last all-female troops, and then they started to mix them. But no, there were no mixed troops at that time.
Interesting. Yeah, because I think the Marine Corps did that up until recently. And I think in some cases, maybe they still do have just the men's and women's platoons for their basic Marine Corps training that they do, which I always thought was kind of different. And I don't know any different, because when I went through, it was just mixed. You're, in a room next to the guys, and everyone's kind of helping each other. And that's all I knew.
Yeah, so it was and I think that that's probably one of the reasons that they moved forward with combining the troops within the RCMP, because to have all females is a very artificial bubble. And in many of the detachments that you go into, certainly some of the smaller ones, you're the only female. So you need to be able to work with your male counterparts, and they need to be able to work with you. So if you're able to train together, then they have an appreciation of the fact that you've gone through the same training and that they can count on you. Because at the end of the day, that's the only person you can count on in some instances. And so familiarity with the training and understanding that the standards, that instills confidence with the people that you're working with.
So I was reading an article on the CBC website, and in that article you said, sometimes the community's perception of a female officer kept me from doing my job. Can you give me sort of some examples about that, or elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, and in the two detachments that I was in, I was the first female member that they had ever seen. It was difficult because I felt as though when we would arrive at a situation, when we're trying to deal with people that are in conflict, oftentimes you're dealing with people on their worst day, that they would automatically talk to my male partner and tell their story to my male partner. Even though I had gone through the same training, in some instances I might have more time in than my male partner, but that's who they deferred to. It was as if they felt that they could tell this male RCMP officer the story, and they weren't really sure what I was doing there. So I found that was difficult. It was frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, I recognized I'm not going to be able to change their perception. I just needed to continue to pursue, to do my job and do what I was there to, what I was paid to be doing. But I found, on the other hand, on a positive note, that in situations where you might have had younger victims or you had female victims, they might have found it easier to talk to me as a female, which I can understand as well. So I think the kind of stereotypical roles that people saw myself and my partners in, they kind of gravitated towards me on the softer kinds of things, and my partner on the things that were more difficult. So it was also difficult with working with the male members as well, because I found that in some instances, when we were responding to incidents, in some instances it was a bit of a hesitation, because it was as if they needed to protect me. Well, I had had the same training that they had had. So for me, it was, don't worry about me. Do what you're supposed to do, and know that I will be there beside you doing what I need to do as well. So the last thing you want is any kind of a hesitation where they're more worried about me than they are about somebody who's more of a threat to them. So it was a real culture change for both the communities that I was involved in policing, but also the members that I was working with, because some of them had never worked with a female member before. So, but you have to kind of work your way through so that people understand, and then they start to trust you. Like, and but it's always continuing to have to prove yourself. Whereas I found that my male partners didn't have to prove themselves. They were automatically accepted. I'm wearing the exact same uniform. I've gone through the same training. I'm equally competent, but it felt as though I always had to try and prove myself a little bit more.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I feel that way sometimes in the military. What was the time period that you were an RCMP member?
82 to 87.
Still probably very new to have women in policing at that time.
Absolutely. Certainly in the RCMP only started accepting females in 1974. So we're less than 10 years after which they've accepted females. And interestingly enough, when I first applied, the RCMP had a point system during the application, and a large percentage of the points were awarded for your height. Well, I'm not very tall. I mean, you can't see that, but I'm not very tall. So I wasn't able to reach the necessary points in order to be a regular member. So I was originally offered to be a special constable. And the special constables at that time worked primarily in airports. But from the time I applied to the time I was accepted, the RCMP had removed the point system and were using a different system to assess their candidates, so that I was able to go in as a regular member of the RCMP.
It's so interesting to hear your story and think about, obviously I'm not a police officer, but I do know some women who are police officers, and just the general attitude of having women in policing now seems so normal. It's because of women like you who went through all that, and sort of proved themselves and proved to other people that they could do that job. And then now it just feels so normal, when a woman's like, oh, I'm applying for the police.
Exactly. Things have come a long way. I mean, we're talking a number of years since I joined. And I would like to think that, policing has come a long way, and it is much more reflective of the community that it polices. And when you look at the numbers, there are more women in Canada than there are men. So interestingly enough, though, is the policing profession continues to have a challenge in attracting females. The other challenge is, once they get them in the door, they have a hard time retaining them. So it's good, it's good to be able to get them in place, but you have to also be able to retain them.
So I think the military is sort of having the same problem now, where they get in the door, but then they don't want to stay. And I mean, I think some of it too is, I don't know if we're ever going to hit that point where it's 50% women in law enforcement or the military, because I think it does take a very certain personality type that a lot of women, they just don't want to do that. So I don't think trying to force someone into a job that might not be the best suited for them, I don't necessarily think that's a good idea. But I do like seeing initiatives for recruiting drives for women's events, because when I was growing up, like, I didn't know that was an option. And I think, I sort of joined a little later. If I could go back, I would have joined earlier. But at the time, like, I didn't know any of these things were an option to me. I think just bringing that awareness out there. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to do with this podcast, is like, look at all of these women who come from all walks of life doing all of these different jobs, and like, this is a job option for you.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that you say that, because one of the roles, I mean, I switched from the RCMP, went over to the military police as an officer. So one of the things that I did in one of the positions that I was in, I attended quite a number of universities talking to folks about the career, talking to them about the opportunities. But it's, both in policing and the profession of arms, it is not an easy life. And, the organizations have come a long way in terms of benefits, in terms of, accommodating that type of thing. But at the end of the day, as you know, in the military, there's the unlimited liability, and they can order you to go and do what it is that they need you to do. So, and that's not necessarily attractive to a lot of folks. I think, they've had some success in terms of getting them in the door, but the issue really is, how are they going to retain them? And, you have other issues, and, people want to have a family, for example, or, and the constant moving around, the deployments, and the rate of deployments has increased. I think it's leveled off a little bit lately, but for a while, people were deploying fairly regularly, and it wasn't just the Army that was deploying. There was, from the Navy and the Air Force were also deploying, and those deployments are very difficult. When you're going to be on ship and you're going to be gone for 6 months, that's really hard on the family. It doesn't matter if you're mother or father or whatever the parental unit is. That's very difficult for folks, and not everybody wants to continue to do that type of work. And when you have married service couples, or then one of them may have to sacrifice their career for the better of the family. So I think it's, and we have the same problem though in recruiting from diverse communities. In some of the immigrants that come to Canada, the military is not necessarily seen as a positive and proud entity. They may come from countries where the military is not viewed in that way. So to try and make them understand that the Canadian military is different, I think, is an ongoing challenge. And there needs to be a lot of focus. And it's unfortunate, because the military really does need to be a reflection of the demographics in the country.
I found almost the opposite. So at HMCS York, where I was for a few years, was like the most diverse unit I've ever been to. And we were doing, I don't know what, it was a presentation one day. And they sort of said, like, okay, how many of you are, first generation Canadians? And so many of them raised their hand. And it was like, well, why did you join the military? They're like, as soon as I got my citizenship, that's what I wanted to do, to give back. And they had this sense of service that I find maybe some kids who are like, fourth or fifth generation Canadians don't really have that.
Yeah, they're very, very patriotic and very, very much want to be part of Canada and serve the country that they're so grateful to have become citizens of, right? So yeah, absolutely.
And so just going back, so what made you make that move from the RCMP to the military?
I think, at the time, the RCMP where I was working, the RCMP were traditionally policing in the small detachment areas, and we were policing a number of small fishing communities. So it was very easy for folks to identify who I was. So whether I was working or not, people were always watching what I was doing. So it got to be, I felt in many instances that I was living my life under a microscope. And that's very difficult when you're young, and, you'd like to be able to kind of, let your hair down, relax, unwind, and always having to be cautious about where I'm doing that and whose presence am I doing that, because you could be interacting with them on a complaint on the next shift type of thing. So for me, it was a combination of the isolation, and the likelihood of continuing to police in those particular communities. For me, was, I just thought that there might be more that I could do. And having served in the Air Reserves, the military was familiar to me, and so I made an application, not knowing if I would be accepted, and was accepted, and was very quickly in Chilliwack for 13 weeks at the time. So, within a very short period of time. So it really didn't give me an opportunity to kind of second guess my decision. And I'm glad for that, because the military gave me great opportunities. I had experiences that I would never have had with the RCMP or any other police force. And so for me, it was like I was coming home, and that felt good. But with the with the operational policing experience, even though I was coming in as a military police officer as opposed to an NCM, I had the policing experience, which was not always the case with some of the direct entry officers who hadn't actually done policing. I had done that. So for me, it was an opportunity both to put that into practice, but also develop some of the leadership and lead organizations.
And so I guess what would be the main role of, for those who don't know, of a military police officer?
So the military police is really, it's not dissimilar to a civilian police organization. It's the difference really is who it is that you're policing. So we have military bases across the country. So the military police have the jurisdiction on the military bases. There's the code of service discipline that they enforce. So there are more things than the civilian police would be enforcing, and it deals with order and discipline. But also there are specialized units within the military police that do, investigations on sexual assaults. So it's the whole gambit of what you would see in a civilian policing, but often just on a slightly smaller scale. But you have the same specialties. You have breathalyzer technicians. You have people that are doing, traffic enforcement. The additional layer, though, is that the military police deploy. So they deploy internationally on missions, and they support the missions through that deployment, through the provision of policing and force protection services.
And so did you do any deployments?
I did. I did 6 months in Sarajevo. So actually I did it. I was there 1 year after. I started 6 months after, but I was there for the 1 year anniversary of 9/11, which my force commander was an American. And we all know what transpired on 9/11. So I was responsible for the military policing, and there were 400 military police from 27 different countries in theater at that time. So we policed the entire country, but each of the sectors had their own military police from their various countries that were present in that sector. But I had the overall responsibility for the military policing, and that included everything from traffic enforcement, safety. We also were responsible for working with various non-governmental organizations that were doing the mass grave exhumation because of the conflict that had happened in Bosnia. And also I was responsible for force protection. So determining what the posture was with people that were leaving the confines of a camp. So how many people had to be in a vehicle, how many people were armed, those types of things. So I worked for an American general, and leading up to certainly the 1 year anniversary of 9/11, it was very, very tense in theater, because people were not exactly sure whether or not we would be looking at another kind of terrorist attack. And we were very visible in Bosnia. It was under the NATO umbrella, so the stabilization force there. And it was a very, very interesting time for me to work with from military police from so many different countries. I had never worked internationally before. I had never worked extensively with military police of different countries. So learned very quickly that we have a lot of things in common in terms of training, but we have a lot of differences. And one of the differences I found very quickly was a number of the military police forces from other countries didn't have females in them. Or if they did have females in them, they certainly were not in leadership positions. So it was interesting for them to kind of look at me and try and figure out how I was the one responsible to give out these orders to the military police of the various countries. It was quite eye-opening for both of us.
Right. Yeah, that was one of the things I was really curious about, was whether or not you faced any resistance from these men from other countries. And if so, how did you deal with that at the time?
For sure. I think, some of it was just direct defiance. And part of the responsibility there was to issue orders, and the orders were to make sure that the various sectors were being policed in the same way. We would run traffic campaigns, because one of the biggest reasons that we were losing military members over there was because of the traffic situation. The roads are not designed for military vehicles. So, if they were proceeding too quickly and in a dangerous fashion, then, they have an accident and you end up losing one. So we put in some traffic safety campaigns. But some of them were just, they just wouldn't listen at the end of the day. So I had a choice from that perspective. I could just say, okay, well, you're going to do it because I'm the boss, and I'll get the big boss to weigh in on it. Or what I chose to do was I had a deputy officer from the Czech Republic. And what I did was in those areas where there was much more resistance, I used him to deliver the orders, and then they followed it. He was a male, and they followed it, because for me it was, I'm going to be here for 6 months. I have a job that I need to do. I'm not going to be able to change an entire country's acceptance or non-acceptance of a female in a leadership position. At the end of the day, for me, the mission was more important. So it was a bit of a way to kind of manipulate the situation, but it was effective. We managed to accomplish what it was that we needed to accomplish. But it was for me, it was an eye-opener, because the Canadian military has had females and female officers in many of the occupations for many, many, many years. So for me, I had grown up kind of in that environment, and to face it in an international theater, I like, it was very difficult for me to understand that, in fact, that wasn't the case everywhere. So that was an eye opener for me, and it was interesting, because when I came back, I had an opportunity to work as the Director of Human Rights and Diversity, which is an out of trade kind of position, but for me it was personally important. And one of the organizations that I was the deputy chair of was the Canadian Women, the Women in NATO Forces. So what that did was, all the NATO countries, we got together 2 or 3 times a year internationally. And what we did was, those of us that had already kind of dealt with some of the issues that the females were dealing with and just being accepted, were able to provide some practices, some processes, some ideas, where they would be able to to influence their organizations and kind of work and give them the foundational pieces to do that. So it was kind of a backhanded way for me to be able to get back at the countries that were stalling the progress of women, by able to be working that and influencing that.
And did you find, were there any men that were sort of very resistant, say at the beginning of your deployment, but then maybe towards the end learned to work with you better, or did they just sort of remain the same the entire time?
I mean, I think that there were kind of 3 groups. There were those that accepted women, from the countries that have had women for a long time. That was never really a problem. You had a kind of a group in the middle that was I was a bit of an oddity, so they weren't quite sure how to figure me out. And at the end of the day, they kind of observe and say, okay, well, gee, she seems to know what she's talking about, so I think we'll follow her, just maybe out of curiosity. And then you have the other groups that were, they didn't have women in their senior ranks. They were not likely going to have them in a short period of time. So I didn't spend a lot of time in working with those, but I spent a lot of time working with the ones that could still be influenced, and of course the ones that were accepting. And then I used my deputy to work with the other countries where there really wasn't a whole lot of opportunity for me in 6 months to be able to change their perspective.
Hopefully it changed them a little bit being there, just changing their perspective on sort of what they had an image in their head of what women might be able to do, and then seeing you do your job.
I hope so. If nothing else, it gave them something to talk about, because they weren't quite sure how to deal with it.
Yeah. And then, so did you do any other deployments?
No, that was the only one.
What sort of other positions did you have within the Canadian Forces?
So I had a variety of them. I started out, my first posting was to the military police platoon in Valcartier, Quebec. So that was right out of my officer training and my military police training. So a female Anglophone Air Force officer posted to a male Francophone, or not male, but an Army Francophone unit. That was interesting. Although I do speak French, it was challenging for me to understand the Army concepts, because we had gotten a little bit of it on our officer training, but not to the degree that was necessary for me to be able to move into that role. And I was a deputy commanding officer there, so it was important to get up to speed really quickly. And in fact, I arrived and my platoon had already deployed to an exercise in Gagetown, so I had to actually join them, meet everybody, join them, and just kind of step into the role shortly after my arrival in Valcartier, which was interesting. I did a stint in computer security, which was also part of, at the time, was a responsibility of military police officers. I was responsible for the military police in Greenwood, Nova Scotia. So I was basically the chief of police in Greenwood, Nova Scotia. Then I came back to Ottawa, and I had a number of positions, more senior level positions. So I was responsible for resource management for the Canadian Forces Provost Marshal. The Canadian Forces Provost Marshal is the chief of police for the military police. So I was responsible for resource management for a period of time. Then I stepped in and did 5 years of professional standards for the military police, which is effectively internal affairs for the military police. So doesn't make you really popular. And then I finished my career as the Director of Human Rights and Diversity. And I just want to talk about the professional standards piece, because it was at a time where there had been an inquiry. There was a detainee that was captured and subsequently killed in Canadian custody, and the military police had been kind of on the periphery of what was going on there, and were not able to act. So there was a whole infrastructure put in place in terms of a public complaints commission for folks to complain about the military police action. So we were really trying to implement new legislation at the time, a very challenging time with civilian oversight. It was the first time that the military police had been subjected to civilian oversight. And in fact, there's not a lot of civilian oversight of the military in general. So we were dealing with that. We were dealing with introducing a code of conduct for the military police, and also a regime where we would conduct investigations into the complaints against military police. So it was a very challenging time, because we were completely changing what the military police understood. It required a lot of focus on professionalization, because it was becoming more and more like a civilian police force with the oversight. So there was a big emphasis on the professionalization piece as well. So it was an interesting 5 years for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that would be difficult in any organization when you're doing anything that involves change. People are usually very resistant. And like you said, it doesn't always make you the most popular one when you're the one that's doing that job.
Exactly. But at the end of the day, the team and I always looked at it and said, if a complaint has been made against a military police member, it's our duty to investigate and either prove that the person did not do what was alleged, or in fact, if they had done it, okay, so where did this go wrong and how can we make changes to avoid it in the future? Because for me, the worst thing would be to have an allegation hanging over somebody's head and not have it resolved. So you needed a resolution one way or the other. I think we did a pretty good job at that at the time.
And out of all of the positions that you've held, what was the most enjoyable for you?
It's a bit of a toss-up. So I think, running the military police section in Nova Scotia was certainly, for me, very rewarding. It was a very active Air Force base. Running a section of my own like that of policing, where they were offering the full gambit of policing, was, for me, it went back to what I knew, what I understood. So I enjoyed that very much. And I would say the Director of Human Rights and Diversity, the professional standards piece was a good position for me to stretch me and really test, putting a new system in place. So that was good from that perspective. The Director of Human Rights and Diversity for me was the last position that I held in the military. And I made the decision after that I wanted to go and do something else. So it gave me an opportunity to have a better understanding of some of the challenges being faced by the 4 employment equity groups. So women, visible minorities, Aboriginal, persons with disabilities. Persons with disabilities less so in the military context, but for the other 3, so be able to work with those advisory groups in order to be able to look at the human rights complaints that came in against the military and make some systemic changes in some instances where it was necessary. But also to be able to sit down with the complainants and understand their story and try to resolve it. So we were able to mediate some of the complaints to give the individuals closure. So for me, after that, I didn't see going back to the military police. That really opened my eyes.
Does someone nominate you for that, or do you apply for that?
I had to, yeah, I had to apply for it. I mean, as much as you apply for a position in the military, but the position was becoming open, and in the military, positions are assigned based on occupation, and that one was kind of an any occupation. But when I saw it, then I set my sights on it. So I spoke to all the people that were necessary and said, I put my hand up and this is what I want to do. And they, it was a bit of a, people kind of looked initially and they thought, why would we put a military police officer in a human rights position? But I talked through and said why it was so important to me, why I was passionate about it, and why it was something that I thought that I could bring some good leadership to. So obviously convinced enough folks, and they gave me the opportunity to do that, and I'm so glad that they did.
Throughout your career, did you see positive changes in the military with regards to women and visible minorities?
Obviously the numbers are tracked very closely in terms of the percentage. So I think we saw iterative changes. Certainly in 1989, all of the occupations were opened up to women. So that was a huge step. The last ones being submarines, because they were a little bit more challenging to put women in submarines. But so that decision by the Human Rights Commission was a huge one in 1989 to see that. So the fact that decision was taken and the Canadian Forces was able to implement that and open up all of the occupations for women, I think is a very positive step. With respect to visible minorities, I think, there were iterative changes. We were able to really focus on some of the policies that were acting as barriers to folks joining. So, from that perspective, I think we made positive change, but it's so difficult in such a large organization of 130,000 all in to recognize significant change. But I think that, we did move the yardstick for sure.
And how do you think that we can achieve to the point where it's not, where there isn't discrimination, where it's not an issue?
Unfortunately, I think that there will continue to be discrimination. I think more recently, over the last couple of years, people seem to have found that they have the right to say what it is that they think, I think we're more and more divided in terms of what's happening. So I think that, the Canadian Forces, like other institutions, needs to really continue to work hard at portraying the fact that the Canadian Forces does offer a very full career. It does, even from what it offers in terms of training. Some of the training in the Canadian Forces is second to none. And that's recognized by various occupations in the Canadian Forces, that after having gone Canadian Forces through Canadian Forces training, they can get civilian accreditations for those things. There will always be those that are attracted to military service. But I think that we need to continue to work at it as an institution. And I think, there are huge efforts right now in trying to change the culture. And that's no small undertaking, because as I said before, the Canadian Forces is a subset of the Canadian population. So the problems that you have in the general population, you have in the military as well. But so I don't, at the end of the day, I don't have the silver bullet in terms of how to do it, but I think there needs to be continual emphasis on recruiting, getting out to the youth. The Air Cadet programs are very important. The Army Cadet programs, the Navy Cadet programs are really important from my perspective, in order to be able to give folks a taste of, while they're very young and impressionable, to give them a taste of what that military experience could be. So if we can put some emphasis there, to make that a positive experience. You might have some hope in retaining some of those folks or having them apply, either go through the military college or, and apply as NCMs. The challenge is Canadian Forces is in competition with everybody else. And people don't necessarily think, geez, I think I'll pursue a career in the military. Like, it's not a default for a lot of folks. Same as policing in general. So we need to continue to, I say we, I'm not even in anymore, but we need to continue to demonstrate the value, to appeal to people's sense of camaraderie, teamwork, the experiences that you can have, serving internationally, and just seeing so many parts of the world and even this country that you wouldn't normally if you stay in one location. But it's a task. It's a task for sure.
Like you said, there is no one right answer, but I think if we do focus on that sort of recruitment and retention, then eventually those people who join will sort of move up the ranks. And you were a lieutenant colonel when you retired. I mean, there probably weren't that many sort of high-ranking women at that time, I wouldn't imagine.
Yeah, there have been a few for sure. Like, were they everywhere? No. In certain occupations, absolutely. If you look at the logistics occupations, for example, there were more women, obviously, that kind of with the type of work that they're doing. You could often go into a room and there weren't more than a handful if there were 100 people in the room, kind of thing. So
after your position with human rights and diversity, then you said you left the military after that. And what did you move on to do?
So I did, like many people in Ottawa, I'm now a public servant. So and I've worked in a number of departments, all in the security and kind of investigative field. So all of the jobs that I've held since I left the military built on the foundation that I had built both with the RCMP and the military police.
What did you enjoy the most about your career in the Canadian Forces?
For me, although, at the time I wouldn't have appreciated it. But now when I look back on it and I look at the opportunities that I was given and the things that I had to do, where I had to push myself, I think that that was probably the most rewarding for me. And to be able to lead troops, and in an international environment, in both with the Army and the Air Force, like, for me, the privilege of being able to lead a team like that, I think is definitely a highlight. But for me personally, it was the fact that there were so many challenges that were put to me that I had to navigate and I had to pursue, and not all of them were easy. And I had failures like anybody else, but the fact that I did something, I could look back and say, I did that. And as I said, there are not very many places in this country that I can go to that I don't have a friend, either from my days as a dependent or from my military service, because people retire all over the country. So, and you have that common bond at the end of the day, right? You might have had a different occupation, you might have had different experiences, but you all wore a uniform at a certain point in time. And that speaks a lot, because people just understand then.
It's funny, I find, with the military people as well. It's like, maybe you haven't seen them since, basic training or whenever, but it's like you just pick up right where you left off, and it's like no time has passed.
Yeah, absolutely. And the military gives you that. It gives you the common foundation piece. So, being a veteran, like it's really been kind of the last 20 years or so. And I would say that the Americans always did a really good job in recognizing their veterans. And that wasn't necessarily as prominent in Canada until kind of I will say the early to mid 90s. Well, maybe the late 90s, because the early 90s were a bit rough in some areas, but towards the end of the late 90s, the individuals really raised the profile of veterans in Canada. So, things like veterans license plates, That didn't exist a number of years ago, but now you can go, and it's a very visible symbol to say that, somebody who's in that vehicle or owns that vehicle has served as a veteran. On Remembrance Day, it's, they take special opportunities to thank veterans. So the recognition for me is a good source of pride. It's, and I have two adult children now, but they're extremely proud of my service. Neither one of them decided to serve, but extremely proud of my service. And when people will, you walk down the street on Remembrance Day and people say, thank you for your service. Like that's huge. And that wasn't the case when I first joined, but it certainly has been the case in the last 20 years or so. And for me, that's huge, because we are now recognizing the veteran community and some of the sacrifices that folks have had to go through in order to be able to serve. And it isn't always easy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have heard that from some other Canadians who sort of have that complaint that the Americans seem to take much better care of their veterans. But hopefully that's another aspect, that they're sort of moving the yardstick and getting better help for veterans that are transitioning out of the military, and supports for them after they leave the military.
Yeah, because I think, a number of years ago it was, you took your uniform off and they said, okay, thanks. That's it. Like, and you're left, right? So for your whole career, you've had a medical system that is there, that, you've had people telling you kind of what to wear, where to go, all those types of things. And then when you retire from the military, it used to be, they're like, okay, well, thanks. And that's it, kind of thing, kicked you out, and you've got to kind of restart, right? But I think now they've worked very hard on assisting veterans to transition. Some of the veterans that are leaving have some significant mental and psychological issues that they need continual care, and you can't just cut them loose and leave them there. So I won't say that it's perfect, and we read about these stories all the time about, veterans that have kind of fallen through the cracks, and veterans homelessness and that type of thing. But at least there's a recognition there now, and there are folks that are trying to assist with that, because it's all you've known for the better part of your life, and all of a sudden to have that taken away is a difficult situation if you don't have something else to go to, if that is your identity.
Just being around sort of like-minded people, and your coworkers and other military members who sort of have that same mindset and behave a certain way and speak a certain way, and then maybe you retire and sort of move to a small town where there's no one like that there. You feel isolated. You don't really fit in, and then that just sort of compounds.
Yeah, it's very isolated. From being part of something to being on your own is a very isolating feeling.
So my last question that I always ask everyone is, what advice would you give to women wanting to join the Canadian Forces?
It's funny, because even when I was in uniform, I would get that question a lot. And when we were doing the sessions with the university students, they'd ask me the same question. So I've had that question over a number of years, and I still get it periodically. And I usually answer the question with a question. And I look back at them and say, why is it that you want to join? Because, for all the reasons we've talked about, while it is an extremely rewarding career, it's not an easy one. And you do have to make sacrifices. So the motivation for a person wanting to join is very important. And the reason from my perspective that it's important is because on those days that it's really, really tough, you can go back to what it is that's driving you. So for me, I ask them the question, and then we have a further on discussion. But the advice that I would provide is make sure that you know what it is that you're signing up for. Make sure that you're doing it for the right reasons, and understand that all of the occupations are open to women. And so there is no barrier to you being a member of any occupation, except for the limits that you impose on yourself. So the advice, I tell them to go for it, because it was very, very good to me. It provided extremely well for my family. as I said, I was pushed to do things that I would not normally have done. But the big piece is why is it that you're looking at the military? Because if you're looking at it for, well, it's just a job, in Ottawa, we get a false perception of what the military is. It's the headquarters, it's a different kind of role. So if it's just kind of a job, then I think that they will be challenged by even getting through recruit training, So that's the first hurdle is what is it that it is that's driving you? Because that's going to be important for you. You get through the training, understand that, the training is serious, but it's also a game. Like it's a game that's being played that will assist you later on. So don't try to go 6 moves ahead. Just kind of go with it at the time, do the best that you can do. And then they will build on it with your occupation training, with any of the specialty training, and let the process work, because it does work. It's incredibly successful. And then enjoy it, because it's as fast as, in as many years as I spent in uniform, it seems like it went by in a second, and really didn't have the opportunity to appreciate some of what it was that I was experiencing until many years later when I look back on it.
And I guess I said that was the last question, but I do want to ask a little bit more. So, because you mentioned when you do have those tough moments, so if you've had those moments in your career, or like you said, it pushed you to do things you never thought you were going to do, what do you tell yourself, or what are your sort of coping mechanisms for pushing past something that you might be resistant to?
I'm incredibly stubborn and incredibly determined. And I got that from my father, who was much the same way. And for me, I always reflect back and think the outright discrimination that he faced, and he still persevered. What I'm dealing with is small potatoes at the end of the day. So the best way to motivate me is to tell me that I can't do something, and then I will make it my life's mission to be able to do it. And, you have to believe in yourself at the end of the day. Sometimes it's hard, but, that too will pass, and just keep focused on what the longer term objective is. Don't stay focused in the day, although you'll need to be able to get through it, but keep focused on what it is that you want to achieve, what it is that you want to get done. And that will help you get through the rough periods, because there are some great high periods as well, but the rough ones can be really, really rough. So I just stayed focused and said, oh yeah, you've told me I can't do this, or you're making it difficult for me, then I'm going to find a way that I'm going to make it work. And if it means that I have to kind of go out between the lines and make my way back in, then that's what I'm going to do, because it's not going to be you that's going to stop me from accomplishing this. And it doesn't matter who the you is. At the end of the day, it's just like, no, I can do this. And a lot of self-talk. I can do this. I'm here for a reason, and I'm going to get there. So that's what always worked for me.
Awesome. Well, Shelley, thank you so much for your time today, for this interview. And thank you for just being an awesome trailblazer for women in the military community and the policing community as well.
Thank you, Kate. This has been awesome.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to help support this podcast, please subscribe and leave a rating and review on your Apple Podcast app.